Good morning, students. Welcome to the second year class of literary terms. In this class, we are going to talk about three terms: tragedy, irony, and soliloquy. So, let us begin with the first term, tragedy. The term is broadly applied to literary and especially to dramatic representations of serious and important actions which turn out disastrously for the chief character. Detailed discussions of the tragic form properly began, although they should not end, with Aristotle's classic analysis of the Poetics. Aristotle based his theory on induction from the only examples available to him, the tragedies of Greek dramatists such as Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. In the subsequent 2000 years and more, many new and artificially effective types of serious plots ending in a catastrophe have been developed, types that Aristotle had no way of foreseeing. The innumerable attempts to stretch Aristotle's analysis to apply to all later tragic forms serve merely to blur his critical categories and to obscure important differences among diverse types of tragic plays. When flexibly managed, however, Aristotle's concepts apply in some parts to many tragic plots, and they serve at least as a suggestive starting point for establishing the differentiator of the various non-Aristotelian modes of tragic construction. Aristotle defined tragedy as the imitation of an action that is serious and also has having magnitude, complete in itself, in the medium of poetic language and in the manner of dramatic rather than narrative presentations, incorporating incidents arousing pity and fear, wherewith to accomplish the catharsis of such emotions. Accordingly, Aristotle says that the tragic hero will most effectively evoke both a pity and a terror if he is neither thoroughly good nor thoroughly evil, but a mixture of both. And also that the tragic effect will be stronger if the hero is better than we are, in the sense that he is of higher moral worth. Such a man is exhibited as suffering a change in fortune from happiness to misery because of a mistaken act to which he is led by his hamartia, or we can say his error of judgment, or as it is often though less literally translated, his tragic flaw. The tragic hero accordingly moves us to pity because since he is not an evil man, his misfortune is greater than he deserves. But he moves us also to fear because we recognize similar possibilities of error in our own lesser and fallible selves. Aristotle also grounds his analysis of the very structure and incidents of the play on the same principles. The plot, he says, which will most effectively evoke tragic pity and fear is one in which the events develop through complication to a catastrophe in which there occurs a sudden reversal in the hero's fortune from happiness to disaster. The Middle Ages, lacking different knowledge either of classical tragedies or of Aristotle's theory, conceived tragedy to be simply the story of an eminent person who, whether deservedly or not, is brought from prosperity to wretchedness by an unpredictable turn of the wheel of fortune. The short narratives in the Monk's Tale of the Canterbury Tales are all, in Chaucer's own terms, tragedies of this kind. With the Elizabethan era came both the beginning and the acme of dramatic tragedy in England. The tragedies of this period owed much to the native religious drama, the miracle and morality plays, which had developed independently of classical influence. But a most important contribution came from the Roman writer Seneca, whose plays became widely known earlier than those of the Greek tragedians. We have different kinds of tragedy. We have the Senecan tragedy, which was written to be recited rather than acted, but to English playwrights who thought that these tragedies had been intended for the stage, they provided the model for a fully developed 5-act play with a complex plot and a formal and elaborate style of dialogue. Senecan drama in the Elizabethan age had two main lines of development. Then we have the revenge tragedy, or we call the tragedy of blood. We also have the domestic tragedy, which was written in prose and presented a protagonist from the common ranks who suffer a commonplace or domestic disaster. Examples of this kind are George Eliot's The London Merchant, or the History of George Barnwell, 1731, which represents a merchant's apprentice who fails into the toils of a heartless courtesan and comes to a bad end by robbing his employer and murdering his uncle, is still read at least in college courses. Further, we can say that tragedy since World War I has been innovative in many other types. including the experimentations with various ancient types. Eugene O'Neill's Morning Becomes Electra, for example, is an adaptation of Aeschylus or Satia, which the locale shift from Greece to New England, the poetry altered to rather flat prose, and the tragedy of fate converted into a tragedy of the psychological compulsions of a family trapped in a tangle of Freudian complexes. T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral is a poetic drama which incorporates elements from two early forms, the medieval miracle play, dealing with the martyrdom of a saint, and the medieval morality plays. So we have talked about tragedy. Let us now talk about what is irony. In Greek comedy, the character called the Iron was a dissembler who characteristically spoke in understatement and deliberate pretended to be less intelligent than he was, yet triumphed over the Alazon, the self-deceiving and the stupid brackets. In most of the diverse critical uses of the term irony, there remains the root sense of dissimulation or of a difference between what is asserted and what is actually the case. The first is the verbal irony. Verbal irony is a statement in which the implicit meaning intended by the speaker differs from that which he ostensibly asserts. Such an ironic statement usually involves the explicit expression of one attitude or evaluation, but with the implication of a very different attitude or evaluation. Thus, in Canto 4 of the Pope's Rape of the Lock, after some plume, egged on by the ladies, has stammered out his incoherent request for the return of the stolen lock of hair, the Baron answers him. To quote, "It grieves me much," replied the peer again, "who speaks so well should ever speak in vain." Unquote. The second kind of irony is the structural irony. Some literary works exhibit structural irony in that they are persistently or even totally ironic. In such works, the author, instead of using an occasional verbal irony, introduces a structural feature which serves to sustain the duplicity of meaning. One common device of this sort is the invention of a knave hero, or else a knave device of this sort is the invention of a knave hero, or else a knave narrator or spokesman, whose invincible simplicity leads him to persist in putting an interpretation on affairs which the knowing reader who penetrates to and shares the implicit point of view of the authorial presence behind the knave persona just as persistently is able to alter and correct. We also have sarcasm. Sarcasm in ordinary parlance is sometimes used for all irony, but it is better to restrict it to the crude and blatant use of apparent praise for dispraiser. To quote, "Oh, you're God's great gift to women, you are." Sarcasm is the common form of irony in dormitory persiflage. The term irony, qualified by an adjective, is also used in a number of specialized senses for literary devices and modes of organization. We have other kinds of irony also, which include the Socratic irony, takes its name from Socrates' characteristic assumption in philosophical dialogue of the pose of ignorance and eagerness to be instructed and a modest readiness to entertain points of view which upon his continued questioning invariably turns out to be ill-grounded or to lead to absurd consequences. We have dramatic irony, which involves a situation in a play or a narrative in which the audience shares with the author's knowledge of which a character is ignorant. The character acts in a way grossly inappropriate to the actual circumstances or expects the opposite of what fate holds in store, or says something that anticipates the actual outcome but not at all in the way what he means it. We have cosmic irony, or which we refer to as the irony of fate, and we have the romantic irony, in a term invented by German writer of the late 18th and early 19th centuries to designate a mode of dramatic or narrative writing in which the author builds up artistic illusion only to break it down by revealing that he is as artist in the arbitrary creator and manipulator of his characters and their actions. The third literary term that we take into discussion is the soliloquy. Soliloquy, as explained, is the act of talking to oneself. In drama, it denotes the convention by which a character, alone on the stage, utters his thoughts aloud. The playwright uses this device as a convenient way to convey directly to the audience information about a character's motives, intentions, and state of mind, as well as for purposes of general exposition. Examples of this kind are Marlowe's Dr. Faustus opens with a long expository monologue and concludes with another which expresses Foster's frantic condition during his belated attempts to escape damnation. The best known of all soliloquies, of course, is Hamlet's speech, "To be or not to be." A related stage device is the aside, in which a character expresses his thoughts or intention in a short speech, which by convention is inaudible to the other characters on the stage. Both conventions, common in the Elizabethan and later drama, fell into disuse in the later 19th century when increasing demands that plays convey the illusion of real life forced the dramatist to exploit indirect means for conveying information and guidance to the audience. So students, in this class we have taken up 3 literary terms: tragedy, irony and soliloquy. In tomorrow's class we are going to take up 3 more literary terms, and after that we wind up with the literary terms and we will switch over to the novel prescribed in your syllabus. Thank you.